Hello there and welcome to a very festive fireside chat. I'm John Barrett.
And I'm Chaz the Chadello. John, what is going on? Are you doing work from home Fridays? What is this?
Well, kind of I am. It's more of a sort of pre-Christmas case of COVID, work from home fireside chat. But you'll see if the COVID doesn't get me, sitting in front of a fire with a cardigan on in the middle of December probably will.
Yeah, good luck with the COVID there, John. Holidays. Well, the good news is that we have two very special guests on set here for our final show of the year. One is the very good journalist and US politics guru, Bill Wyman. Welcome, Bill.
Welcome. Hi, good to see you.
And the other is a very good boy, Mercury the Whippet. Welcome, Mercury.
Oh, well, I've got a very good girl here at home with me, Chaz and Bill and Mercury as well. There's Dolly the dog. I don't know if you can see her. Dolly, say hello.
Hello.
But I've got a great guest coming up a little later in the show as well, Chaz. I'm going to be talking to Doug Gross, one of the real legends of Republican politics in the crucial first-to-vote state of Iowa. It is 1 month today until the Iowa caucuses. Can anybody catch up with Donald Trump, or is it all over already? We'll get Doug Gross's take on that. You've got some guests too.
Certainly do. We've got a couple of great guests. Writer Peter Beinart will be looking at the free speech debate triggered by controversial comments made by some university presidents last week. One's already paid with her job. And lawyer Jill Wine-Banks is here to talk about the latest in the trials of Trump. But first, it's official. The House of Representatives has formally approved of an impeachment inquiry into Joe Biden. Along partisan lines, 221 to 212, the House has been unofficially investigating the president for, 3 months at least. But they're kicking things up a notch now, mainly to give their subpoenas more legal weight. Until now, the White House has been blowing off House subpoenas, saying the inquiry was unconstitutional, that it amounted to congressional harassment for political purposes, and that it hasn't been authorized by the House of Representatives. Just this week, Hunter Biden blew off a subpoena for him to testify, saying that he was either going to testify publicly or not at all.
Republicans do not want an open process where Americans can see their tactics, expose their baseless inquiry, or hear what I have to say. What are they afraid of? I'm here. I'm ready.
And that kind of tactic might be the main reason that the Republicans got the votes for an official impeachment inquiry in the first place. Republican Ken Buck, for example, was no friend of the impeachment push, but he had serious misgivings about the White House's tactics.
Aaron, I'm struggling right now, I have to tell you. On the one hand, I have come out strongly and said that there is no direct evidence linking President Biden to the activities of Hunter Biden. And I have, at the same time, the White House recently sent a letter after these committees issued subpoenas to the White House. The White House sent a letter back and says, you haven't held an impeachment inquiry vote yet, and we're not going to give you any records until you pass an impeachment inquiry. I think that is an absolutely wrong position, and it's a delay tactic which would necessitate Congress going to the courts and having the courts enforce the subpoena. So I wish the White House hadn't done that. I don't think there is direct evidence. I'm struggling, and I want to read the resolution before making a final decision on whether to vote for it or not.
And so he voted for it. Meanwhile, House Speaker Mike Johnson has been accused of hypocrisy given the comments that he made exactly 4 years ago about Trump's first impeachment. Those comments seem like they were written specifically for Democrats about this impeachment.
The founding fathers warned us. I mean, they feared a single-party impeachment. They knew that it would bitterly divide the country. It might be irreparable damage to the country. If you don't like the president, he goes on the ballot again after 4 years. We have an election in 11 months. Let the people decide this.
Right down to the date. It was perfect. But for what it's worth, this is how Mike Johnson justifies his change in position.
There's a big distinction between what's happening now and what the Democrats do. Those are rushed, sham impeachments. They did it quickly. They did not follow any of the procedures that I just described. We have 3 committees investigating this and following the truth where they lead and they have no option in doing anything else. It's Ways and Means, Judiciary, and Oversight, and they've uncovered some alarming facts about the Biden family and their dealings.
John, are you buying this? Is this a reasonable step for House Republicans to be making?
Well, it's a reasonable step if you're looking at this as a purely political exercise, which of course it is, just as the Democrats' impeachment of Donald Trump on 2 occasions during his presidency was. There is no doubt that this is a high-stakes gamble from the Republicans. They will hope probably to string this out and hope that they can at least sort of create a counter-narrative to everything we're going to be hearing about Donald Trump once his many and varied trials resume in mid-January of next year. Republican members of the House chairs have been saying, well, you know, where there's smoke, there's fire. But to be honest, at the moment, all we've really seen is a bunch of people walking around going, can you smell smoke? I think I can smell smoke. Can you smell? That's definitely smoke. There is a lack of hard evidence to connect President Biden to anything that Hunter Biden has done. And this is not the impeachment of Hunter Biden. This is the impeachment of Joe Biden. And right now, while only a slim majority of Americans support an inquiry, they don't support an impeachment. So can Republicans find some smoke? Can they find some fire? They've had a long time looking for it and they haven't come up with it yet, so we'll just see.
Yeah, and I guess if the Democrats have any complaints about the impeachment, the Republicans can say, yeah, we didn't like the impeachment you guys did, but then you set the precedent and now we're following the precedent. And yeah, hypocrisy is the order of the day in Washington, as we all know. Bill, tell me, right now it's just an inquiry, but are we inevitably heading towards an impeachment trial in January, just like Trump faced all over again?
You know, a few months ago, I would have said no. But actually, when you think about it, you have to give Mike Johnson credit for keeping his caucus together and getting such a strong vote on this. I mean, I don't know if there was any Republican drop-off, so they've got the whole Republican caucus of the House of Representatives in the clown car right now for the particular issue. So, and I just think they've all decided that if nothing else, they can keep this up in the air for the next 6 or 8, even 12 months until the 2024 election.
John, what do you think? Are we heading for exactly the same thing as last time, or is this going to be something different this time?
It'll be different, Chaz, because, of course, this is going to get tangled up not just in the Republican presidential primaries getting underway in mid-January, but also those 2 big chunks of spending bills that have to pass in January and February. And then, of course, there's the little matter of funding the war in Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and border security. So all of that is happening when they come back from their holiday break. But bear in mind, Republicans can only afford to lose 3 votes to be able to take it to the next stage, and they can only afford to lose 3 votes to formally impeach Joe Biden. And then, of course, there is no prospect whatsoever of getting 67 votes in the Senate. So just as with the 2 impeachments of Donald Trump, this is leading to acquittal in the Senate. The big question in my mind, Chaz, is how long do they string this out? Do they just, is it like a quickie divorce? They get it over and done with in January and February so they can say, hey, look, Biden's been impeached too. Donald Trump isn't really that bad after all, a certain amount of Me Tooism. Or do they, as Bill suggests, drag this out? Because if there is something there, if there is smoke, if not fire, the longer they drag it out right through election year, the more paint they knock off Joe Biden. So how quickly they get this done will tell us, really, is anything there.
Yeah. Well, carrying on with the legal theme, the Supreme Court's now considering 2 crucial questions that could drastically affect the prosecution of Donald Trump for the events of January 6th. We told you about the first one on Wednesday. Trump is claiming that his conduct on January 6th is immune from prosecution and that he was acquitted by his impeachment trial anyway, and so he can't be tried again for the same conduct. Jack Smith has gone straight to the Supreme Court to ask them what they think about that theory in order to get this question decided as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court has chosen to hear the case of Joseph Fisher, a little-known January 6 defendant who is challenging a charge of obstructing an official proceeding, that proceeding being the certification of Joe Biden's election win. Now, what does that have to do with Trump? Well, 2 of Trump's 4 charges in the January 6 case are the same thing. So if the Supreme Court holds that those charges are illegitimate, then Trump gets off them as well. The question, of course, is how far back these cases then push the January 6 trial. I could speculate, and I often have, but we do have on hand a lawyer who was one of the Watergate prosecutors that faced exactly this situation. So why don't we ask her? Jill Winebanks, welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
Now, the Supreme Court has already asked Trump's team for submissions by December 20 about their immunity appeal. So what do you reckon the chances are that the Supreme Court will actually take this case and allow Jack Smith to just leapfrog over the DC Court of Appeals?
Of course, I'm going to compare it to what happened in Watergate, where we did leapfrog the Court of Appeals and got a very speedy response. We went immediately from approval by Judge Sirica at the district court level to the Supreme Court, and they heard arguments during what would normally be their summer recess and decided within days of hearing the arguments. So it is possible to do this quickly when the public interest is at stake, as it is in this case. In terms of the substance, I really believe that the immunity will be denied, that there is no immunity for criminal conduct while you are president, but acting in a capacity other than as president. And even if you were within the limits of the presidential conduct, I would think you wouldn't get immunity for a clear violation of the law. But what he did was not in his role as president. It was in his role as a candidate for president.
So if the Supreme Court does want to take care of this immunity claim as quickly as possible, how soon could it be before the main trial takes place? Is March still on the cards?
It is. I would think that they could do this within weeks, certainly within months. It shouldn't take very long to brief the issue from the parties, to hear arguments, and to decide. We applied mid-May for certiorari. It was granted almost immediately, and we argued the case within 2 months and had a decision in that same time frame. So I would say it's a couple month delay, but that isn't that much, and it shouldn't affect the trial date because so much is already prepared. And so I think it could go forward, certainly no more than maybe a month after it's scheduled.
Is there any point holding Trump's January 6th trial before the Supreme Court has fully considered the seemingly legally identical questions with his other January 6th defendant?
If he has immunity, then there is no trial. This one, you could have a trial and it could be an acquittal. It could be that they decide that it isn't what they wanted, but it could go ahead and be decided post-trial as it was here. Yes, it would definitely impact the end result if they decide that this is not an official proceeding. But remember, there are 4 counts. 2 are official proceeding counts, 2 are not. So if it goes to trial and he's convicted on, let's say, all 4, the 2 that aren't official proceeding charges would stand even if this other defendant prevails at the Supreme Court.
And going back to the immunity claims of Trump, if the Supreme Court doesn't take that case and it goes back to the DC Court of Appeals, can any part of the main January 6th trial take place while they're waiting for the DC Court of Appeals to deliver their verdict in that one question?
Well, the judge in the case, Judge Chutkan, has put on hold the trial until there is a decision. And at the same time that Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, applied for an expedited hearing, skipping the Court of Appeals, he also applied for an expedited hearing in the Court of Appeals, and they are having briefings on that as well. So it is possible that the Court of Appeals could say, okay, we'll expedite this, we'll have briefings in 3 weeks, and then we will hear arguments 2 weeks later. And so the delay in then going to the Supreme Court by whoever loses that decision could be, it's certainly a few weeks of delay that you would hope not to have, but it still could go forward pretty quickly. I think that the Supreme Court will see this for what it is, which is it's going to end up there anyway, and it's not something that they need the guidance of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals in order to decide. So I think that the Supreme Court can grant the expedited hearing and take the case. You know, they could expedite it and then decide not to hear the substance of it and to send it back to the Court of Appeals. So Jack Smith was smart to apply for expedited hearing in both courts.
Given all the delays that Trump's team will undoubtedly be pushing for, not just in this trial, but all his trials, what's the latest that a trial can be pushed to before it becomes too close to the election and then has to be postponed to after the election?
Oh, that's such a good question. And of course, it is an issue that has never been decided. There has always been a policy at the Department of Justice. So for now, let me talk just about the federal cases as opposed to the New York criminal trial, as opposed to the civil trial that's ongoing right now, and or the Georgia state case. At the federal level, there's been a policy not to try someone just before an election. And so I would say when you get to Labor Day in September of 2024, that's when the campaign really goes into full swing. It would be hard to start a trial then. If you were in trial, you might be able to finish the case depending on how far you were into the trial. So that's where I think you run into a problem. There are two federal ones. There's the Mar-a-Lago theft of documents and obstruction of the investigation of that theft that is pending in Florida. And then, of course, the election case that's pending in DC.
And finally, given all this, if you were a betting person, just pretend, if you're a betting person, which of the 4 major criminal trials involving Trump next year would you expect to actually be held before the election?
I'm not counting on Judge Cannon, who has indicated a preference for doing something to help Donald Trump out. I would say that it will either be the Jack Smith election case or Fani Willis's RICO, Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organization conspiracy case. Those are the two that are pushing for a trial. The problem with Fani Willis's is she's looking at an August request for a trial. And that gets very close to my September cutoff. And the prediction is that it will take more than a month to try. So that one, I would have to then say, I'm back to Jack Smith's election interference case being the top one. And that would be my prediction. But a lot can happen that will change that. It's very hard to predict the future.
Jill Wine-Banks, thanks for visiting Planet America.
Thank you. My pleasure. Hope to see you again.
But Bill, these aren't the only legal questions facing Trump's team, I believe. You've been following Rudy Giuliani's travails. What's going on with him?
Exactly. He's involved in a lot of Trump's cases, but he's got his own special trouble right now in Washington, D.C. And what happened, if you remember, after the January 6th insurrection, there was a lot of talk about election malfeasance. Rudy Giuliani, for no reason at all, targeted these 2 election workers in Georgia, took generic footage of an election counting site and decreed that they were passing around illegal ballots, that they were handing thumb drives back and forth like heroin, and generally saying that these people were helping overthrow the election. These 2 women got caught up in it and were targeted by pro-Trump supporters.
Just to be clear, those thumb drives, they were like mints, weren't they?
They were actually mints.
Yeah.
They testified, right?
Yeah, so go on, yep.
So it was all made out of whole cloth. There's literally been no evidence at all that they're anything but innocent people simply working at the polls and were dragged out and held up for public obloquy by this very powerful person.
And they're suing him for defamation, I believe.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And now, as you know, it's very hard to win a defamation case in America. Yeah. And generally, it involves one little stray word or sentence. This is an onslaught by not only Giuliani, but also the president and a lot of other people about these poor women who were driven out of their homes, their work. They lived from Airbnb to Airbnb. They endured racist threats, taunts, and attacks. And they testified they feared for their lives. Now, here's the sad thing. The judge said, look, this isn't even a trial. What you guys said about these poor women was defamatory and untrue. The case is just about damages. Crazily, Rudy Giuliani has doubled down on this and has been standing outside the courthouse saying what he said all the time was true, even though the judge had already said it wasn't. Okay? I think what we're going to see, the jury is now up for deliberations, and I think we're going to see a very high monetary award directed at him. And remember, there's 2 plaintiffs, and so the award is going to be for each of them. So he could be being hit with a lot of money.
And that's interesting because he's already broke. So he's going to be the brokest man on earth.
That's really true. And one of the interesting things is that for cases like this, you don't get out of the awards through bankruptcy. So even if he declared bankruptcy, these awards, if they are given to him, and we don't know yet if they will or not, these will follow him until the day he dies.
Well, good luck, Rudy. Now, with only 1 month until the crucial first-in-the-nation Iowa caucuses, Republican frontrunner Donald Trump is more than 30 points ahead of his nearest rival Ron DeSantis in the average of polls. Although some polls have that closer to 20, others have Nikki Haley in second place, so look, there might still be time for a late shift, although I personally strongly doubt it. But who cares what I think, John? You've been talking to someone who's been involved with Iowa's caucuses for almost half a century.
Yeah, absolutely, Chaz. And it's important to understand that when we talk about the caucuses in Iowa, it's very different to a primary election or the kinds of elections we have here in Australia. A caucus is more like a town hall meeting. In the old days, they used to conduct these things in barns, in people's living rooms. These days, they tend to be in neutral venues like school gymnasiums or classrooms. So you have maybe 50 or 100 people gathered, cramming themselves under the kiddies' desks. You'll often hear people talking on behalf of various candidates, and then they vote. The Republicans and Democrats have different ways of doing this, but this is always done at night time, usually on a Monday or a Tuesday night in the middle of winter in Iowa, where it gets very, very cold. You can often have snow up to your waist out on the streets. So you have very low turnout. Out of a state of 3 million people, you maybe have 150,000 people taking part in these caucuses. That's why the Democrats are basically trying to get rid of caucuses. The Republicans are doing them on January 15th. And to talk about where the candidates are 1 month out, I'm talking to Doug Gross, who has run Iowa caucus campaigns for the likes of Mitt Romney. He's been working on caucuses since the 1970s, basically. Doug Gross, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. Thanks for joining us from beautiful downtown Des Moines.
Great to be with you. Enjoy it.
Tell me, we can all see the published polls. I know the campaigns do their own polling, but you see signs beyond the polls. You get a sense of who's organising, who's got the volunteers, who's got the energy. What are those signs that you look out for at this point leading up to the caucus, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, it's important to remember that caucuses are like a student council election where the electorate is quite small, quite focused, and everybody sort of has their clique. And the important thing is to get your friends and your neighbors out to the caucuses on the night of January 15th. So it's difficult for polls to sort of capture where that is. And so what I see on the ground right now is Trump, unlike 16, Trump does have a good organization in Iowa. He's got a strong base with the evangelical community, which comprise almost 60% of the likely caucus goers. So Trump is well organized. We can't discount that. And because of that, I think it's likely he wins here. But he's created expectations that are so high that it may be a problem for him. And the key for Iowa is who can finish a strong second. And right now, I'd give the edge to Nikki Haley, largely because DeSantis is going after the same clique or same voters as Trump is. And frankly, he's like Trump light. He doesn't people that want that sort of thing, DeSantis is not that appealing for lots of reasons. And so they're going to go with Trump. Nikki Haley appeals to probably a 30 to 40% of the electorate that really wants an alternative to Trump, but they still want a conservative candidate. And so as a result of that, she has real room to grow and a real opportunity.
Doug, explain to us a little bit about the dynamic of the social pressures around caucusing. Republicans, they do have a secret vote in their caucuses, but there is also a very sort of public meeting and people advocating, giving short speeches often on behalf of various candidates. So neighbours can get a sense of what their neighbours are thinking. They've got yard signs, they're door knocking. It is a very participatory form of election that clearly you can try and sway your neighbours to your way of thinking.
There's a lot of neighbor-to-neighbor conversations going on in Christmas parties in neighborhoods all over Iowa right now, because this very much is a neighbor-to-neighbor type campaign. And you go to your neighborhood gathering where there's a school gym or a church basement, and each of the candidates will have a representative that makes their speech, but you're all there physically, and you're all there have the ability to give some indication who you wish to vote for. There is a straw poll that is anonymous, but nevertheless, people have a pretty good sense of who's for whom during those small meetings. So it's a very, very grassroots-oriented campaign, and as a result, it's tough to dominate it just with the media. You really need an organization, and that's the other thing that probably helps Haley right now is the Americans for Prosperity, which is the political group established by the Koch brothers. It's a conservative, sort of a free trade group in Iowa that's been organizing here for over a dozen years, have shifted all their support to her. She did not have a lot of grassroots organization, but they're using their organization to help her, and that's a huge plus for her.
Doug, on the plus side for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is the high-profile endorsement of your current governor, Kim Reynolds, and some fairly influential, at least prominent, Christian conservative leaders in the state. Do you think those endorsements are going to help him to any great extent?
Well, historically, endorsements have limited value in caucuses. Again, largely because it's such a personal feeling individual caucus goers have to have about candidates, and many of them have met these people, in some cases multiple times. Endorsements have greater impact when people don't really know the candidates. In this case, in Iowa, they've pinched them, they've talked to them, they've quizzed them a number of times, so they have limited value. I think, for example, Terry Branstad endorsed Lamar Alexander back in the 90s, late 90s, and Lamar Alexander dropped out, during the straw poll even before the caucuses. So and Terry Branstad was the longest serving governor in the history of Iowa. And I think Ann Seltzer's Iowa poll, which recently just came out, shows that they have a marginal value, but probably no more than a couple of 3 percentage points.
How do you reconcile the appeal of Donald Trump in Iowa? He seems a little bit of an outlier compared to maybe the Mike Huckabees and the Rick Santorums and even back in the day, the likes of Pat Robertson. People who did well typically were, I don't know, more godly than Donald Trump. Is it fair to say?
They certainly were. They certainly were. Donald Trump has changed the Republican Party in the country and in Iowa dramatically. Historically, the Republican Party was composed of defense hawks, of evangelical voters, and folks who were conservative economically, free traders, and folks who believed in less government. What Trump, and as a result, the working class populist group that want government to work for them, and they feel aggrieved because it doesn't, or they perceive that it doesn't, they were the bailiwick of the Democratic Party. Trump has changed all that. The populists, the working class voters now are Republicans, and almost exclude. I would suspect that 80% of laboring union workers in Iowa will go for Trump in the caucuses. So he's changed that dynamic very dramatically, and as a result, changed the party. Now, the downside for him in that is that they're not traditional Republicans, so they're not used to going out in the caucuses. So they'd probably rather have a beer at the bar than go into the caucus. And so he's going to have a difficult time getting all of them out, and they're not on traditional lists. While Haley, on the other hand, will probably appeal to more traditional Republicans who normally go to these things. Now, they're not the majority, but they're more likely to show up.
Doug, the old saying goes, there are 3 tickets out of Iowa. Is it safe to say that next January, if Ron DeSantis only gets the 3rd ticket, given his low polls in New Hampshire, he's probably done?
Yeah, this is everything for Ron DeSantis. He has to finish second and reasonably strong. It has to be at least 30% or above for him to have a ticket out of here, because he's not even really competing in the next primary state, which is New Hampshire, and Haley is doing quite well there, and so is Trump. So there'll be 2 tickets out of Iowa if Haley finishes second. If DeSantis finishes a strong second, there'll be 3 tickets out.
And as for Donald Trump, given those high expectations you talk about, what is a damaging result for him if he still wins? How close do either Haley or DeSantis have to get to suddenly turn this into a more competitive-looking primary?
Yeah, Trump is marching around the state saying he's ahead by 59 points. And one of the cardinal sins of a candidate in a caucus race is lower expectations don't raise them. But Trump defies all norms anyway, so that's not unusual. But my feeling on this is that if he doesn't get in excess of 50% of caucus goers on January 15th, it'll be deemed a loss for him. And as a result, and if Haley, for example, or even DeSantis for that matter, finish in the mid to high 30s, it'd be a major win for either one of those. And they would be hot going into New Hampshire. And then South Carolina comes after that, where potentially a Trump-Haley match could be the be-all, end-all for the campaign.
So good to talk to you, Doug. Thank you very much for taking the time for us.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Now to the week's biggest controversy. Even before October 7th, America's elite universities had earned themselves a reputation as being inconsistent when it comes to free speech. According to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression's free speech rankings, MIT is ranked 136th out of 248 universities when it comes to free speech. The University of Pennsylvania comes 247th out of 248, and Harvard comes dead last, 248th out of 248. Yet despite that, all three universities have been associated with flare-ups of anti-Semitism, especially after October 7. So, the presidents of all three of those universities were hauled into a House committee to answer for why these anti-Semitic incidents were allegedly occurring on campus. And it's fair to say, things did not go well.
Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct? Yes or no?
If the speech turns into conduct, it can be harassment, yes.
I am asking specifically calling for the genocide of Jews. Does that constitute bullying or harassment?
If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment.
So the answer is yes.
It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
It's a context-dependent decision. That's your testimony today. Calling for the genocide of Jews is depending upon the context. That is not bullying or harassment. This is the easiest question to answer yes, Ms. McGill. So is your testimony that you will not answer yes?
If it is, if the
yes
speech
or
becomes,
no?
if the speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment, yes.
Conduct meaning committing the act of genocide? I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric. When it
and is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
That first president, Liz McGill, has already been fired, and the second president, Claudine Gay, she's on thin ice. But a number of people have suggested that this whole outrage was incredibly unfair, because what Elise Stefanik, the politician that you saw there, was referring to as calling for genocide was quite a bit short of actually calling for the killing of Jews.
Let me ask you this. You are president of Harvard, so I assume you're familiar with the term intifada, correct?
I've heard that term, yes.
And you understand that the use of the term intifada in the context of the Israeli-Arab conflict is indeed a call for violent armed resistance against the state of Israel, including violence against civilians and the genocide of Jews. Are you aware of that?
That type of hateful speech is personally abhorrent to me.
And there have been multiple marches at Harvard with students chanting, quote, "There is only one solution, intifada revolution," and, quote, "globalize the intifada." Is that correct?
I've heard that thoughtless, reckless, and hateful language on our campus, yes.
So based upon your testimony, you understand that this call for intifada is to commit genocide against the Jewish people in Israel and globally, correct?
I will say again, that type of hateful speech is personally abhorrent to me.
Now, apart from the fact that the presidents were talking like unresponsive robots, which was a little bit off-putting, the first takeaway there is when Elise Stefanik is talking about calling for genocide, she's actually talking about saying things like globalize intifada, which is referring to revolution, not genocide, and from the river to the sea, which some people say the logical extension of that is that Jews would have to be killed in Israel for that to happen. But it doesn't necessarily mean that when someone on the campus in America is saying that. Exactly. She is making a huge assumption when she's saying when they say that is calling for genocide. In reality, she's talking about potentially outlawing just standard protests there, because that's what standard protests say. Yeah. So my question to you, Bill, is that you actually work in academia. You see this firsthand. What's your take on all of this?
Well, I totally agree. And in fact, I was getting a real flashback to my own university years, because back then you had the exact same rhetoric coming down on universities for the exact same issue, which is criticism of Israel. And when I was at university, actually, there was a paper called the Berkeley Graduate, which the graduate department put on, and they did a cover story, and it said Menachem Begin, who was the prime minister back then, you'll remember, Israel's holy terror. And it was a little history of Menachem Begin and his involvement in the creation of the State of Israel. And boy, did that cause a conflagration. The university tried to defund the magazine and all this stuff. And if I was the editorial editor of the daily newspaper at the campus and duly said, look, this is crazy. Someone should be able to articulate that opinion and not be punished for it. This is the home of free speech. This was University of California at Berkeley. So I feel like I've seen this all before. Back then you heard endless stories about political correctness on campus. The New Republic, which was a very neocon sort of publication back then, ran a big story, and I don't know if you remember this controversy, but semiotics at Brown University. And semiotics is a very arcane field of study, which is basically film studies. Brown is the least of the Ivy League universities. So that was the big scandal back then. So we've seen this many times before.
Well, it's comforting that we've been here before and we're not treading horrible new ground. But given your background then, tell me, what was your take on
Well, it's so embarrassing that this is something in America we'd say, you can hit this one out of the park, okay? When those university presidents could have said, this is exactly why we have a First Amendment, Congresswoman Stefanik, because the government should not be defining what speech is and the meaning of words and then bringing the weight of the government down on them. People disagree with the meaning of those words. I think most Americans don't even know what intifada means. And of course, if you want to talk about anti-Semitism in America, we can talk a lot about the supporters of Donald Trump, who we've seen and whom your avatar Donald Trump is called very fine people. And let me just say that my definition of free speech does not involve insurrections and trying to overthrow a duly elected election, which again is something you've been an apologist for yourself. Those are the sorts of things that a university president can say. And they can also defend free speech and criticize the students. And in fact, here's another thing you didn't hear. A lot of students at Harvard have been disciplined for this. Some of the people who are shouting those slogans have actually been in university discipline right now for that and other charges. And do you want to know what the name of one of the groups were? Harvard Jews for Palestine. Okay, so you literally have Jewish groups, which brings me to another important point. That in America, the debate around Israel is very, very limited, okay? I know from talking to Peter Beinart, you'll know that the debate about Israel inside Israel is much more strident than you're allowed to debate in America itself. And of course, there's a lot of Jews in America who are appalled at the actions of the State of Israel. It's very hard to find purchase in that because they immediately get called anti-Semitic, and that's another thing that's going on here. But the winner in all of this, Elise Stefanik, who went up against the three university presidents. She's now a superstar. They went back with their tails between their legs. So it was a big, big win for the Crazos in the House of Representatives again. So you have to give them credit for that.
Yeah, it definitely worked out well for her. Well, regardless of what we think, the controversy has been raging on, especially amongst Jewish academic types like our next guest, as foreshadowed by Bill, Peter Beinart, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents and author of the Beinart Notebook on Substack. Peter, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you.
Now, in your view, how much of a problem is anti-Semitism on campus?
There is a problem with anti-Semitism, including on campus. One of the things we know from studies, both from the United States and other countries, is when there's more violence in Israel-Palestine, the number of reported anti-Semitic incidents tends to go up. Actually, also Islamophobic incidents as well. So it's not surprising in that context that there would be more anti-Semitism on campus, but it's difficult to know exactly how much because there are very different definitions of anti-Semitism that are being used in the American public conversation. And so how much anti-Semitism one sees partly depends on whether one interprets certain kind of pro-Palestinian activism and speech as anti-Semitic or not.
So what did we learn, if anything at all, from that hearing into campus anti-Semitism the other day?
I think we learned how pathetic and dishonest many members of Congress are, And I think we learned that the university presidents were unwilling to actually confront the discourse that was being aimed at them. And I'll try to explain what I mean by this. So Elise Stefanik, the Republican congresswoman, it stipulated that people who were chanting Intifada were calling for Jewish genocide. Now, that premise is just wrong. Intifada means uprising. There have actually been intifadas against Arab governments. The intifadas that have taken place against Israel, the first and second intifada, took some nonviolent forms, particularly in the first intifada, and some horrifyingly violent forms, for instance, the suicide bombings of the second intifada. But they were, whether those, even when those actions were murderous and immoral, they were taking place as uprisings against oppression. They were not efforts at killing all Jews. The problem was that because the university presidents had clearly been told by their lawyers or someone not to get into any actual substantive discussion of Israel-Palestine, they didn't challenge the premise. They essentially accepted the premise, and then they were over a barrel, because had they said, then had they said, we will ban these statements of Jewish supposed genocide against the Jews, they would have basically put themselves in a position where they were committing to banning pro-Palestinian speech like Intifada. On the other, but because they didn't say clearly that you can't say genocide to the Jews, it seemed like they weren't against calling for Jewish genocide. The right answer would have been, of course, there's a problem with saying that people protesting for the genocide of the Jews, but that's not what people were doing when they called for Intifada.
How would you say universities have responded to concerns about anti-Semitism, and what do you think they should have done differently?
I think universities have an obligation to keep all of their students safe from intimidation, bullying, harassment, of course, violence. But I think beyond that, universities are educational institutions. So the right response to what happened on October 7th, the horrifying attacks, and then Israel's kind of catastrophic attacks in Gaza, is education, is to bring scholars who study this, to give students the context so which would allow them to understand that. But I think what we've seen instead sometimes is pressure from donors to crack down on pro-Palestinian speech on campus. They then want to use the framework of protecting Jewish students as a means to suppress some of this speech and punish the students who engage in it. The irony of this is that on almost all of these campuses, some of the students who are engaged in this pro-Palestinian activism, which supposedly threatens Jewish students, are themselves Jewish students. So for instance, at Columbia University, they did not only suspend Students for Justice in Palestine for very dubious reasons, it appears, based on the reporting, but they also suspended a left-wing Jewish group called Jewish Voice for Peace in the name of protecting Jewish students from pro-Palestine activism.
It's a weird question, but why are we expecting better from university presidents? Aren't uni presidents these days like any other corporate CEOs, and they're primarily concerned with bottom lines and not getting sued?
I think, unfortunately, that is often the case, but universities are not corporations. They have a very, very special role in our society, to be an incubator of ideas, to be kind of places where there can be free expression, where people can express unpopular and uncomfortable views, and where one doesn't have to think primarily about the bottom line. And the tragedy of this is that, if there should be any place that could be able to not have to worry so much about its bottom line, it would be a place like Harvard University, which has a vast, massive, massive endowment. This is not an institution that is in financial trouble, right? So if you donors get upset, fine. You should be able, we should want leaders who say, I'm sorry, I'm in the business of protecting people's ability to express themselves and have these robust debates. And if they're unpopular, well, that's part of what university is supposed to do. Again, so long as students aren't actually threatened or intimidated or harassed, but if they're made uncomfortable, well, that's part of what's supposed to happen at a university.
Now, Peter, I want to read you a quote from a Washington Post op-ed written by a member of the University of Pennsylvania's Open Expression Committee. She says that universities are too preoccupied with free speech and that they should be more worried about, quote, encouraging civil dialogue across differences, cultivating critical listening skills, developing the skills to build community relationships, promoting the ability to engage in moral reflection, and building resilience in the face of challenge. What do you say to that?
I mean, those are all very good skills to have, but where I think it becomes a problem is if when one starts to say, well, this speech is not constructive as we define it, or this speech is hurtful because it upsets people, and therefore we're going to limit that. Of course, in an ideal world, we would like everyone to be civil, to be thoughtful, to be polite, to be caring in the way they speak. And yes, universities should try to teach people to inculcate those values. But first of all, those things are subjective to some degree. So things that one person might think are thoughtful and constructive, other people may not. And the point is to be able to have a conversation about it. And if you try to shut down that conversation because you don't like the nature of some people's speech, again, if people are being personally threatened or intimidated or harassed, that's a different category of thing. But if one is just making statements that others may find upsetting, many of the things that the pro-Palestinian students are saying are genuinely upsetting to significant number of the Jewish students. Some of the things that the pro-Israel students say are also upsetting to the Palestinian students. So it seems to me the answer is to allow these conversations to take place and for universities to try to do what they're supposed to do best, which is education on these issues.
Finally, there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding out there about these kinds of topics. So what do consumers of the mainstream media like us not understand that we should?
Well, I think one thing that is not often well explained in the media is that being pro-Israel doesn't mean that you are not anti-Semitic. Oftentimes in the discourse, people say, well, if you're anti-Israel, then that means you don't like Jews. And if you're pro-Israel, it means you do like Jews. Now, sometimes that's the case, but sometimes it's actually kind of the opposite for this reason. There are people in the United States who believe in the principle of ethno-nationalism. They basically believe in the idea that every country should be controlled by one tribe. And based on that principle, they kind of like Israel because that's the Jewish country where the Jews run things, and they think it's good that Jews are in their place when they are running things. But oftentimes those same people don't really like the Jews in America very much because Jews in America are opposed to America being a white Christian country. Or in Hungary, and a lot of far-right leaders in Europe really like Israel. They even see Israel as a model for the kind of ethno-nationalism they would like in their countries, but they are quite hostile to their own Jewish populations because those Jewish populations are in opposition to the efforts to define those European countries or the United States as Christian countries. And so it's not, I think one of the things that doesn't come across well enough in the public discourse is that it's quite possible to be both Zionist and anti-Semitic. Indeed, there's a long, long history of that. Theodor Herzl himself, the founder of political Zionism, himself said at one point that he believed that anti-Semites would be the Zionism's best allies because they didn't want the Jews in Europe, the anti-Semites, and so they would be supportive of Jews having their own country.
Peter Beinart, thanks for joining us on the Fireside Chat.
Thank you.
And that is all for the Fireside Chat. We're going to be back on January 12th on ABC News to preview the Republicans' Iowa caucus. The regular Planet America will also return in 2024 on Wednesday nights on ABC TV. Starting at the end of January, we'll be covering New Hampshire primary, the run-up to Super Tuesday, the Trump trials, all the rest of it. Thank you very much to our special guest, Bill Wyman.
Thank you, Chad.
Thank you.
And you too, John.
And don't you forget the Pet Podcast. Our final episode of the year is next week. Will be our Hunter Biden special. All the evidence dissected in one podcast. John.
Yes, and Chaz, well, we're very happy to be back next year for Planet America and the Fireside Chat. Our thoughts this week are very much with our good friends and colleagues at the ABC Drum program and everyone from the ABC News programs. You've all done terrific work over many, many years, and we're sad to see you go. But from us, for now, Merry Christmas. We'll see you soon.
Merry Christmas.